The blood had been scrubbed from the floorboards, but she could still smell it. A phantom scent of iron and betrayal that clung to the air in their small cottage. A ghost of a life they had fought to leave behind. Sarah stood motionless in the center of the room, her body a statue of coiled tension, her eyes fixed on the letter lying on the simple wooden table. It was the only thing in the room that didn't belong. Its parchment was too white, its ribbon too crimson, its wax seal, the snarling obsidian wolf of the Volkov royal line, an obscenity in the quiet sanctuary they had built with their own hands. He hadn't meant for her to see it. She knew that. He would have tried to hide it, to burn it, to protect her from the poison it carried. But she had been hunting, and the messenger, a pale and trembling Moroi youth who couldn't meet her eyes, had arrived in her absence. Nikolai found her there when he came in from the garden, his hands full of late-season herbs, the scent of crushed mint and damp earth clinging to him. He stopped, his smile faltering as he followed her gaze. The herbs fell from his grasp, scattering across the floor. He didn't look at the letter. He looked at her face, and in his eyes she saw the same dread that was clawing its way up her own throat. The world they had escaped had found them, and it had come to drag him back. She was a guardian, a shield forged of two worlds and belonging to neither. Dhampir guardians required blood every 3 days to maintain peak combat effectiveness. Not human blood, they could survive on ordinary food, but Moroi blood, freely given, carried the magic that sharpened their senses, quickened their healing, made them the predators that could hunt predators. The academy taught that the bond between guardian and Moroi was sacred, protection given for sustenance shared. He was a prince, a scion of a dynasty that measured its age in millennia. Theirs was a love paid for with a throne, a family, a future written in the ancient laws of their kind. In the 5 years since he had renounced it all, they had found not a kingdom, but a life, small, quiet, and fiercely protected. But the past does not die, it sleeps. And now it had awoken, with a summons written in blood and ink, a demand from the family that had disowned him. This is the story of what happens when a broken vow comes to collect its debt. A story of a love that must survive not only the world that would tear it apart, but the very sacrifices made to save it. When did it arrive? Nikolai's voice was low, carefully stripped of emotion, but she could feel the tremor in it, an echo in the fine bones of her own body. They were tuned to one another, a harmony perfected over years of shared silence and whispered fears. "An hour ago," Sarah answered, her voice rough. She did not move, did not break her stare from the imperial seal. It felt like a living thing, a predator crouched on their table. The boy who brought it could barely stand. He looked like he'd run all the way from the capital. He probably did. Nikolai knelt, slowly gathering the scattered herbs, his movements deliberate, methodical. It was what he did when the world threatened to spin out of his control. He found small, tangible tasks. He made order from chaos. In the early days, after the renunciation, he had spent weeks building the stone wall that now enclosed their garden. His hands, once trained for statecraft and ceremony, bleeding and raw. He had called it building a defense. She knew he had been building himself a new life, stone by painful stone. She finally tore her eyes from the letter and looked at him. The last light of dusk filtered through the window, catching the silver in his dark hair, a subtle map of the years they had stolen. He was no longer the clumsy, laughing boy she had trained at the academy, the one who tripped over his own feet but could charm a legislator into treason with a single smile. The academy sat in the mountains, neutral ground between the Moroi territories and human lands. It had trained guardians for 8 centuries, taking Dhampir children at age 6 and returning them at 18 as living weapons. It was funded by the Moroi Council, administered by retired guardians, and staffed by those too scarred, in body or soul, to continue field duty. Sarah had entered at 7. She could barely remember her mother's face. The softness in his face had firmed into a quiet strength, a resilience she had watched him earn. but now she saw the shadow of the prince returning. A subtle tightening of his jaw, a distance entering his eyes as he looked at the sigil on the floor. He was seeing not a home, but a kingdom. "You're not going to open it," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a command, a desperate plea disguised as an order. It was the guardian in her speaking, the Dhampir whose sole purpose, hardwired into her very DNA, was to stand between her charge and the coming blade. He finished gathering the last of the mint and rose, setting the bruised leaves on the counter. He walked to the table, his steps unnervingly steady, and stood opposite her. The simple wood between them felt like a chasm. "Sarah," he began, his voice impossibly gentle. "We can't ignore it." "We have," she countered, her own voice sharp with a fear she refused to name. "For 5 years we have. That was the bargain. You gave up the throne, the power, the family. You gave it all up for this, for quiet, for peace. They have no right to ask for anything. They have no claim on you." "A claim of blood is not so easily discarded," he said, his gaze finally falling to the letter. He reached out, his long fingers hovering over the wax seal. She saw the ghost of a flinch in his hand, the muscle memory of 1,000 such letters, 1,000 royal commands. "My father would not send the royal messenger, would not use the wolf seal, unless it was a matter of the gravest importance." "Something is wrong, Sarah. Terribly wrong." "Something is always wrong in that viper's nest," she spat, the venom of her own past rising. She remembered the court, the cold, assessing eyes of the Moroi elite, the whispers that followed her down marble hallways. Half-breed, bodyguard, pet. They had never seen her as Nikolai's partner. They had seen her as his possession, or worse, his mistake. Let them solve their own problems. It's what they do. They scheme, they betray, and they survive. You are not part of that anymore. He looked up at her then, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. It was the deep, aching grief of a son who loved a family that had never truly loved him back. "They are still my blood," he whispered. "My father, my mother, even Darius. If they are in danger—" "They put you in danger," she insisted, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "They gave you an ultimatum, them or me. You chose me. You cannot unchoose that, Nikolai. You cannot step back into that world. It will devour you. It will devour us." He finally broke the seal. The crack of the wax was like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. He unrolled the parchment, his eyes scanning the elegant, severe script. She watched his face, reading the story there before he spoke a word. She saw the tension in his brow deepen, saw his jaw clench, saw the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of ash. He held the letter for a long time after he finished reading, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly. "What is it?" she pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What do they want?" He lowered the letter, his gaze distant, lost in a place she couldn't follow. "The border clans are unifying," he said, his voice hollow. "The Strigoi attacks have been coordinated. They've taken the northern garrisons. Fort Ashworth has fallen." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Fort Ashworth was the kingdom's bulwark against the undead, the Strigoi. Strigoi were not mindless. The newly turned were savage, yes, all hunger and rage. But the ancient ones, the ones who had fed for decades, retained cunning. They could plan. They could wait. And they could be bargained with, if you had something they wanted more than blood. The fortress was considered impregnable. For it to fall meant the threat was existential. "How? The wards, the guardians stationed there?" "All gone," he said softly. "The letter says there was a betrayal from within. The wards were sabotaged. The Strigoi didn't just attack, they were invited in." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a terrible understanding. "They want me to come back. They believe the clans will only listen to me. I spent years building relationships with their elders, learning their dialects, their customs. Father never cared for it. Darius thought it was beneath him. They need me to negotiate a new alliance before the Strigoi push south to the capital. It's a trap, she said immediately, the words a raw instinct. They exiled you. Why would they trust you now? Why would the clans trust a prince who abandoned his title? Because I am the only one who ever treated them as equals, he said, a flicker of the old prince, the diplomat, in his voice. And my father? He is not asking. He is commanding. As a royal of the Volkov line, I am summoned to defend the realm. You are not a royal of the Volkov line, she said, her voice breaking. Not anymore. You are a gardener and a scholar, and the man who makes tea for me every morning because he knows I forget. You are mine, Nikolai, and I will not let them have you. He came around the table, closing the space between them. He took her clenched fists in his hands, his touch warm and steady, a familiar anchor in the storm that was breaking inside her. He gently uncurled her fingers, lacing them with his own. Sarah, he said, his voice so quiet, so full of a sorrow that mirrored her own. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his gaze. She saw the conflict warring there, the duty to his blood, the loyalty to their life. But beneath it, she saw the one thing that had never wavered, his love for her. When I left, he said, I swore an oath, not to them, but to myself. I swore that I would never again be a pawn in their games. I swore that my life was my own. But I am still a Moroi. There are hundreds of thousands of lives at stake. Innocents, humans and Moroi alike who live in the southern territories. If the Strigoi break through... He didn't need to finish. They both knew what a Strigoi horde could do. It was the stuff of Dhampir nightmares. Then send the royal guard, she pleaded, even as she knew it was useless. Send your brother. He's the crown prince now. It's his duty. Darius is a warrior, not a diplomat. He would meet the clans with threats, not respect. He would drive them straight into the arms of the Strigoi, Nikolai said, his expression grim. I know it, and my father knows it. That is why he sent for me. This is the one thing I can do that no one else can. She felt the cold tendrils of inevitability wrapping around her. She could fight a Strigoi. She could fight an assassin. She could stand against an army. But she didn't know how to fight this. She didn't know how to fight the ghost of a crown. If you go, she whispered, the words tasting like ash, they will not let you leave again. They will use this. They will find a way to keep you. Then you will come with me, he said simply, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. He squeezed her hands. You are my guardian, are you not? You swore to protect me. My place is with you. Their world, our world, it doesn't matter. As long as we are together. But she knew he was wrong. It did matter. It mattered more than anything. Going back there meant reopening every wound, facing every ghost. It meant watching them try to tear him away from her, piece by piece. It meant returning to a place where their love was not a sanctuary, but a sin. She looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the crimson seal on the letter, the wolf's eyes seeming to mock her. She had been born to protect him, trained to die for him. And she realized, with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty, that the greatest danger he had ever faced was not a Strigoi or an assassin's blade. It was the family he couldn't bring himself to abandon, and the home that was about to become their cage. She nodded, a single sharp jerk of her head, because the thought of him going alone was more terrifying than the thought of going with him. All right, she said, her voice the calm, steady tone of a guardian accepting a mission. We'll go, but we do this my way. We trust no one, and the moment the threat is neutralized, we are gone. No arguments, no farewells. We walk away and we never look back. Swear it, Nikolai. He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. His eyes held hers, a silent vow passing between them that was stronger than any royal decree. "I swear it," he said. And in the dying light, she prayed it was a promise he would be able to keep. The journey to the capital was a descent into a shared past. Every league they traveled stripped away a layer of the life they had built, replacing the scent of pine and wild earth with the dust of memory. They rode hard, speaking little, the urgency of the summons a palpable presence between them. For Nikolai, Sarah knew, every landmark was a milestone of his gilded youth: the ancient forest where he'd first learned to track, the river where he'd nearly drowned as a boy, the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains that cradled the city of Volkovgrad. For her, the landscape was a map of her own servitude, the geography of a life spent in the shadows of others. She remembered the academy, a place of brutal efficiency and emotional sterility, where she had been honed into a weapon. Dhampirs were rare, prized for their strength, their sun tolerance, their preternatural senses. They were the perfect guardians, a bridge between the mortal and immortal worlds. They were taught from childhood that their lives were not their own. Their purpose was singular: to protect the Moroi from the Strigoi and from themselves. Love, family, a life of one's own, these were luxuries afforded to those they guarded, not to the guardians themselves. The lessons were carved into her with sweat and blood and ritualistic denial. A guardian who loved their charge was a compromised guardian, a liability, a failure. She had been the best of her class, cold, efficient, untouchable. And then they had assigned her to him, Prince Nikolai Volkov. He was her final training assessment before she was to be assigned to a royal. He was, without question, the worst fighter she had ever seen. He was all grace and charm outside the training ring, but the moment he picked up a practice stake, he became a tangle of uncoordinated limbs. He was too thoughtful, too hesitant. He saw a sparring partner, not an opponent. He tried to anticipate, to reason, when what was needed was pure savage instinct. She had been merciless. She had put him on his back in the dust of the training yard 100 times. She had criticized his every move, dismantled his every failed strategy, her voice a cold, impersonal scalpel. She had been trying to forge him into something that could survive. He, in turn, had been trying to make her smile. He'd brought her a wildflower he'd found growing by the armory. He'd told her a ridiculous joke in the middle of a disarming drill. He'd asked her questions about herself, about her life before the academy, questions no Moroi had ever bothered to ask. He wasn't interested in her skills. He was interested in her. The first time he made her laugh, it had felt like a betrayal of her training. They were practicing knife defense, and he had fumbled his block, the wooden training blade spinning out of his hand and landing perfectly balanced on the tip of his boot. He'd look down at it, then up at her, with an expression of such comical surprise that a sound had escaped her, a short, sharp bark of amusement she hadn't recognized as her own. His face had lit up with a triumphant grin that was more dazzling than the midday sun. In that moment, something within her, something she had thought long dead, had stirred. She had requested a reassignment the next day. The commandant, a stern Moroi woman with eyes like chips of ice, had denied it. "You are making him better, guardian," she had said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And he is softening your edges. An interesting experiment." Sarah had felt like a specimen under glass. As they rode now, the spires of Volkovgrad rising in the distance like black daggers against a bruised purple sky, she felt that same sense of being trapped in someone else's experiment. The city hadn't changed. It was a fortress of Gothic grandeur, all sharp angles and cold stone, built to intimidate and endure. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of tradition and the suffocating scent of power. When they reached the city gates, the guards, clad in the obsidian and silver of the royal house, recognized Nikolai instantly. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, confusion, and poorly veiled contempt as their eyes flickered to Sarah, who rode beside him, not behind him, her hand resting near the hilt of her blade. She was not in a guardian's uniform. She wore the simple, practical leather and wool of a traveler. She was not his shield, she was his equal. And to them, that was the greatest transgression of all. They were led through the city, the clatter of their horses' hooves echoing on the dark cobblestones. Faces appeared in windows, whispers followed them like a foul wind. The prodigal son had returned, and he had brought his half-breed whore with him. Sarah kept her face a mask of indifference, her senses stretched taut, cataloging every shadow, every rooftop, every flicker of movement. This was familiar territory. The enemy was not always the one with fangs. The royal palace was a mountain of carved stone and stained glass, a monument to a dynasty's arrogance. It was designed to make one feel small, insignificant. It had always worked on her. As they dismounted in the central courtyard, a figure emerged from the grand entrance. Darius. He had his father's height and his mother's chilling beauty, but his eyes were his own, sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. He was flanked by 2 royal guards, their faces as impassive as stone. "Brother," Darius said, his voice smooth as polished marble, yet carrying an edge of mockery. "You received our father's message. We were so very concerned you might have misplaced your sense of duty." "I misplaced nothing," Nikolai replied, his tone even. He slid from his horse and moved to help Sarah, a gesture of familiarity that did not go unnoticed by his brother. Darius's eyes narrowed. "I see you brought your pet," Darius continued, his gaze sweeping over Sarah with blatant disdain. "I suppose old habits die hard, though I would have thought 5 years in the wilderness might have improved your taste." Sarah felt a familiar surge of cold rage, but she locked it down, keeping her expression neutral. She met Darius's gaze without flinching. She was not the awed, intimidated novice he remembered. "Prince Darius," she said, her voice level, "it is a comfort to see the palace remains as charming as ever." A flicker of surprise crossed his face before his lips curled into a smirk. "She's learned to speak. How quaint." He turned his attention back to Nikolai. "Father is waiting in the throne room. He is anxious to hear your thoughts on our little border problem. Try not to track mud on the carpets." With a final, dismissive glance at Sarah, he turned and swept back into the palace, his guards falling into step behind him. Nikolai watched him go, his face grim. He turned to Sarah, his hand finding hers. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of her hand. "Don't be," she said, her voice low. "He's exactly as I remember. It's good to know what you're facing." She gave his hand a squeeze. "Let's go see the king." The throne room was a vast, cold cavern of a space, designed to amplify the power of the man who sat at its center. King Valerius Volkov sat upon the obsidian throne, a throne carved from a single, massive block of volcanic glass said to have been cooled by the blood of the first Strigoi. He was an imposing figure, his face a severe mask of aristocratic authority, his eyes holding the chilling stillness of a predator. Queen Evangeline stood beside him, a figure of ethereal beauty and tragic fragility, her hands clasped before her, her expression unreadable. They walked the long expanse of polished black marble, the sound of their boots the only noise in the cavernous room. Sarah walked half a step behind Nikolai now, the old instincts taking over. This was not their cottage. This was a hostile court. Here she was his shield. The guards lining the walls watched her every move, their hands on their swords. Nikolai stopped a respectful distance from the throne and bowed his head. "Father, you summoned me." "Nikolai!" the king's voice boomed, echoing in the hall. It was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. "You have been gone a long time. The world has continued to turn in your absence." "I am aware," Nikolai said. "Your letter spoke of the northern garrisons, of Fort Ashworth." "It has fallen," the king said, his voice tight with fury. "A betrayal of the highest order. The border clans are in chaos. Some are fleeing south. Others, we hear, are negotiating with the Strigoi for their own survival. They have always been a fickle, primitive people." "They are a proud people," Nikolai corrected him gently. They respond to strength, but not to tyranny. If you have threatened them— I have done what is necessary to secure my kingdom, Valerius thundered, rising slightly from his throne. The kingdom you abandoned for that. He waved a dismissive hand in Sarah's direction, not even deigning to look at her. Sarah remained perfectly still, her eyes forward, her face impassive. She was a stone, a wall. His words could not touch her. She would not let them. Her name is Sarah, Nikolai said, his voice dangerously quiet. And she is the reason I am still alive to answer your summons. The subject is not open for discussion. For a moment, the king looked as if he might strike his son down for his insolence. The air crackled with tension. It was the queen who broke the silence, her voice a soft, melodic whisper. Nikolai, my son, we are glad you are home. Your father is concerned. The threat is greater than any we have faced in a generation. We need you. What you need, Nikolai said, his eyes still locked on his father's, is an alliance. You need me to speak to the clan elders, to remind them that we have a common enemy that will not distinguish between a Moroi royal and a clan child when it feeds. Precisely, the king said, settling back into his throne, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He had gotten what he wanted. His son was talking strategy. The matter of the Dhampir could be dealt with later. Darius has been preparing the royal guard. He will ride north with you, a show of force. No, Nikolai said immediately. Darius will only antagonize them. His presence would be seen as an insult. I will go alone, with my guardian. He glanced back at Sarah. King Valerius followed his gaze, his eyes finally landing on Sarah. It was like being pinned by a glacier. His look was cold, analytical, and utterly dismissive. The half-breed? You would trust your life to her over your own blood, over the elite of the royal guard? I have trusted her with my life every day for the last 7 years, Nikolai said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. I have never had cause to regret it. I will not be taking Darius. I will not be taking his army. I will take Sarah, and I will ride to the Shadow Fen and speak with Elder Kalin. That is my offer. Take it, or find another way to save your kingdom. For a long, tense moment, father and son stared each other down. A battle of wills waged in the echoing silence of the throne room. Sarah felt a flicker of pride. This was not the boy she had known. This was a king in his own right, though he wore no crown. Finally, the king gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Very well. Go. Secure the alliance. Remind the clans where their loyalty lies. Do this, and you will have proven that some small spark of your mother's noble blood still flows in your veins. He turned his gaze to the queen, who offered Nikolai a small, watery smile that did not reach her eyes. You will be given chambers in the west wing, the king declared, his voice once again booming with authority. See that your companion is quartered appropriately. The implication was clear, in the servants' barracks. We will require 1 suite, Nikolai stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. We will not be separated. The king's jaw tightened, but he merely waved a hand in dismissal. He was done with them. The audience was over. As they turned to leave, Sarah chanced a look at Darius. He was watching them, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a smile of calculation. He had not been angered by Nikolai's refusal to take him north. He had been pleased. And in that moment, Sarah's guardian instincts screamed. The betrayal that had brought down Fort Ashworth had not been an isolated event. The rot was here, in the cold, black heart of the palace. And he was smiling at them. The suite they were given was opulent, cold, and felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Gilded furniture stood stiffly against walls hung with tapestries depicting glorious, bloody moments from Volkov history. The bed was a monstrous 4-poster affair draped in heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the light. It was a room designed for a prince, not for a man who found more comfort in a simple cot by a warm fire. Sarah moved through the space with the silent, economical grace of a predator, checking the windows, the fireplace, the adjoining dressing room. Her senses were on fire, overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of the place. It smelled of dust and secrets, of perfume and decay. Nikolai stood by the large window, staring out at the manicured palace gardens below. They were beautiful, sterile, and perfectly ordered, every flower and hedge constrained to a rigid geometry, a perfect metaphor for the court itself. "Well," he said, his voice laced with a weary irony. "It's good to be home." Sarah came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She didn't look at the gardens. She watched his reflection in the dark glass. "This isn't your home, Nick. Not anymore." "I know," he sighed, leaning his forehead against the cool glass. "But being here, it stirs things. Memories. It's like trying to breathe underwater." He turned from the window, his eyes finding hers. He looked exhausted, the weight of his family, his kingdom, settling onto his shoulders like a shroud. "Thank you for what you did in there, for standing with me." "I'll always stand with you," she said softly. "But you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about the Strigoi and the clans. Your father, your mother, they see you as a tool, a solution to a problem. The moment you are no longer useful, they will discard you again." "I know," he repeated, though she could see the flicker of pain the words caused him. The hope of a son, however faint, dies hard. "And Darius is planning something," she finished for him, her voice grim. "He wasn't angry that you refused to take him. He was relieved. He wants you to go north. He wants you out of the way." Nikolai frowned, considering her words. "Why? He's the crown prince. The throne is his. My abdication was final and absolute." "Is it?" Sarah countered, stepping closer. "The Volkov dynasty followed the law of primogeniture. Eldest son inherits. But the old families, the ones whose bloodlines predated even the Volkovs, remembered when kings were chosen by council, when power was earned, not inherited. They watched Darius with distrust, and Nikolai with hope. The king knew this. Darius knew this. It was why Nikolai's abdication had been demanded so publicly, to kill that hope before it could take root. Some of the old guard, the ones loyal to your mother's line, they never accepted it. They always saw you as the rightful heir. Darius knows that. With the kingdom in crisis, if you were to ride north and succeed where he and your father have failed, you would return a hero. Your popularity would soar. You would become a threat to him, whether you wanted to or not. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of deep frustration. "This is why I left. This constant poison, this endless calculation. Everyone is a piece on a board. I don't want to be a hero, Sarah. I just want this to be over." "He won't let it be over," she insisted. "He will use this opportunity. He'll either let the clans or the Strigoi kill you, or he'll arrange an accident on the road. Either way, you're eliminated, and he can swoop in, avenge your death, and solidify his claim to the throne. He wins, no matter what." Nikolai stared at her, his expression a mixture of horror and dawning recognition. He knew his brother's ambition. He had seen its cruelty before, but he had never imagined it would extend to fratricide. "He wouldn't," he whispered, the words lacking conviction. "He would," Sarah said with chilling certainty. "Power is the only thing your brother has ever loved." She reached out, her hand cupping his jaw, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Which is why we are not going to the Shadow Fen. Not yet." He looked at her, confused. "But the clans are a piece of the puzzle, but they aren't the whole picture. Fort Ashworth fell because of a traitor. Your father said it himself. We need to find out who that traitor is. We need to know who opened the gates. because I would bet my life that whoever it was, they answer to Darius." A new light entered Nikolai's eyes, the weary prince replaced by the sharp-minded scholar, the man who saw patterns others missed. "The communication logs," he said, his voice quickening. "The messenger ravens from the northern forts. They would all be kept in the royal archives. If there were any unusual communications before the attack, any orders that broke protocol, they would be there," Sarah agreed. "And no one would think to look. They are focused on the enemy without, not the enemy within." She gave him a grim smile. "It seems you have some reading to do, my prince. I, on the other hand, need to reacquaint myself with the palace staff. A guardian learns more in the servants' halls than a king ever learns on his throne." For the next 2 days, they moved in a world of shadows and whispers, a silent two-person insurgency in the heart of the enemy's camp. Nikolai needed access to the royal archives, but his credentials had been revoked years ago. On their second evening in the palace, as they walked through a dimly lit corridor, Queen Evangeline appeared from a side passage. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted. She glanced around nervously before stepping close to Nikolai. "Mother," he said, surprise evident in his voice. She said nothing, simply reached out and pressed something cold and metal into his palm. He looked down. It was her signet ring, the queen's seal, delicate silver worked with the ancient symbols of her house. "The archivists are old, my son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They remember when this ring opened any door in the palace. They do not know I gave it to you." She squeezed his hand once, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I cannot help you openly, but I can give you this. Be careful. Your brother, he has become something I no longer recognize." Before Nikolai could respond, she turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving only the weight of the ring and the ghost of her perfume. Nikolai stared after her, his jaw tight with emotion. Sarah touched his arm gently. "She loves you," she said softly, "in the only way she knows how." Using the queen's ring, Nikolai buried himself in the dusty, labyrinthine archives, poring over months of military correspondence. The archivists, ancient Moroi who had served since his grandfather's time, were half-blind and paid him little mind. They saw the queen's seal and bowed, assuming royal business. He worked through the night, his scholar's mind piecing together fragments of information like shards of broken glass. Sarah, meanwhile, became a ghost. The Dhampir barracks were a place of transient faces. Guardians came and went like the tide. Assignments changed, nobles died, new bonds formed. No one questioned another Dhampir in grey. They simply nodded, shared bread, and spoke of the only thing that united them, the Moroi they served and the Strigoi they hunted. She shed her traveler's clothes for the simple dark grey attire that marked off-duty guardians, a disguise that made her all but invisible. She moved through the training yards, the armory, the barracks, listening. Dhampir's senses were a formidable tool for espionage. She could hear a whispered conversation from 50 paces, smell the sour tang of fear on a guard's sweat, see the subtle tick in a courtier's eye that betrayed a lie. She used her academy credentials, all Dhampir's recognized academy training markers, in fighting style, terminology, the particular scars that came from specific drills. She claimed to be newly rotated in from a minor noble house's guard detail, waiting for her next assignment. She learned that morale among the palace guard was low. They felt the king was mishandling the crisis, that Prince Darius was too rash, too arrogant. They spoke of Nikolai's return in hushed, hopeful tones. They remembered him as the prince who knew their names, who had trained alongside their Dhampir guardians, who had never treated them as inferiors. She was storing away names, faces, gauging loyalties. These would be their allies if things went wrong. On the evening of the second day, she was near the western training grounds, in the shadow of the old fortifications, when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 guards, young and careless, were complaining about a recent assignment. 3 nights in a row watching the old servant's way, one grumbled. It's a fool's errand. No one's used that passage in decades. Orders are orders, the other replied, taking a long drink from his flask. Captain Valeric was clear. Prince Darius's personal command: watch the passage, no one in or out, and no record of the watch in the logs. Sarah froze in the shadows. An unlogged secret watch on a forgotten passage. It made no sense. Unless someone was using it. Unless the passage wasn't as forgotten as everyone thought. She slipped away, her mind racing. Captain Valeric. She knew the name. He was the commander of Darius's personal honor guard, a man whose loyalty to the crown prince was absolute. She found Nikolai back in their chambers, surrounded by stacks of parchment, his face pale with fatigue, but his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. "The supply manifests," he said without preamble as she entered. "I found it, Sarah. I found the pattern." He spread several documents across the table, pointing to entries marked with a particular seal. For 3 months leading up to the attack, the supply convoys to Fort Ashworth carried less blood than what was recorded in the central quartermaster's logs. The manifests show the royal approval uses a deputy seal, authorized by order of the Crown Prince's office. Standard administrative procedure. But look at this. He pulled out another stack of papers. These are from the Palace Chamberlain's office, daily schedules for the royal family. On every single date one of these reduced manifests was approved, Darius's official schedule shows him away from the palace. Hunting trips, border inspections, diplomatic visits to minor houses. "So he has an alibi," Sarah said, leaning over the documents. "That's what I thought at first," Nikolai said, his voice quickening with excitement. "But then I started cross-referencing. Kitchen logs showing meals served to which chambers, guard rotation records showing who was posted where, stable records showing which horses were taken out." He tapped a specific date. This day. Darius's schedule says he was hunting in the eastern forests, 3 days' ride away. But the kitchen log shows breakfast delivered to his chambers. The stable records show his personal mount never left. And the guard rotation shows Captain Valeric posted at the Crown Prince's door all day. "He was here," Sarah breathed. "He was in the palace the entire time, using the deputy seal to authorize the sabotage while maintaining official deniability. Every manifest, every date, the pattern holds." Nikolai's eyes were hard, his scholar's certainty now absolute. "He systematically starved our guardians. Fort Ashworth's Dhampirs would have been fighting at half strength by the time the Strigoi attacked. They didn't stand a chance. And I know how he's been coordinating it," Sarah said, her voice tight. She told him about the secret watch on the old servant's way. He's been using it to send and receive messengers, bypassing the royal rookery entirely. That's how he communicated without leaving a paper trail you could find in the archives. Nikolai stared at the documents, his expression hardening into something she had rarely seen. A cold, quiet fury. The last vestiges of brotherly affection, of hope for his family, died in that moment. "He's not just planning to get rid of me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He orchestrated the fall of Fort Ashworth. He sacrificed hundreds of guardians and soldiers. He endangered the entire kingdom, all to consolidate his own power, to remove me as a perceived threat. And he'll keep doing it," Sarah said. "We have to stop him. We have to show this to your father." Nikolai looked up from the documents, his eyes meeting hers. A sad, bitter smile touched his lips. "And what do you think my father will do? Acknowledge that his chosen heir orchestrated a massacre? He would sooner bury this evidence, and us along with it, than admit such a catastrophic failure of judgment. The scandal would shatter the dynasty. No, we cannot go to the king." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked. "We can't let him get away with this." "We don't have to," Nikolai said, a new, dangerous light in his eyes. He carefully rolled the incriminating documents. "My brother wants to play games of shadow and intrigue. He thinks I am only a scholar, a diplomat. He has forgotten what else the academy taught me." He looked at Sarah, and for the first time she saw a reflection of her own lethal focus in his eyes. He has set the board. Now we will make our move. He wants me to go north. Fine, we will prepare to go north. But first, we are going to pay a visit to the old servant's way tonight, and we are going to catch his messenger. The old servant's way was part of the original fortification, a narrow passage built when the dynasty feared poison more than siege. His grandfather had shown it to both princes in childhood, a secret shared between blood. The passage emerged at a postern gate in the crumbling western wall, overlooking the oldest part of the city. It was meant to provide escape during a siege, an emergency route for the royal family. Now it served a darker purpose. As Sarah and Nikolai approached under the cover of a moonless sky, her Dhampir senses confirmed what she'd suspected. She could smell the faint, fresh scent of oil on ancient hinges, see the subtle scrape marks on the stone floor where the gate had been recently opened. Someone had restored the mechanism, making it operational again. The 2 guards Darius had posted were lazy, confident in the secrecy of their post. They huddled in a small alcove near the gate, their backs turned, sharing a flask to ward off the cold. Amateurs. Sarah moved with a silence that was less about stealth and more about a complete absence of presence. She was a shadow, detaching itself from other shadows. One moment the guards were complaining about the wind, the next they were on the ground, unconscious, never knowing what had hit them. Nikolai moved to examine the gate mechanism, his scholar's curiosity momentarily outweighing the danger. "Remarkable," he whispered, running a hand over the ancient ironwork. "Someone's fitted it with a counterweight system. It would open silently with minimal effort. This took planning. Resources." "He's been preparing this for a long time," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the wall. "Someone's coming." She could feel it, the subtle disturbance in the air, the crunch of boots on distant gravel. "Get back!" They concealed themselves in the deep shadows of the passage entrance, melting into the ancient stone. Minutes later, a figure emerged from the darkness outside the city walls. He was cloaked and hooded, but he moved with the wiry, predatory grace of a professional killer. He approached the gate, gave a soft, 3-part whistle, the call of a nightjar, and waited. From inside the palace grounds, an answering whistle came, and then the heavy gate swung inward with barely a whisper of sound. Captain Valeric stepped out, his face hard in the starlight. "You're late," he hissed, his voice a low rasp. "The roads are thick with patrols," the messenger replied. His voice was rough, professional. He handed Valeric a small, sealed scroll. "The target leaves at dawn?" "As planned," Valeric confirmed, tucking the scroll into his tunic. "Everything is in place?" "The Blackwood Ravine is ready, 20 men positioned. We'll leave clan arrows, Strigoi wounds. It will tell the story the master wants." "Good," Valeric said with a cruel smile. "And the female?" "No survivors," the messenger promised. The master was clear. Sarah had heard enough. Before Nikolai could even react, she moved. She was a blur of shadow, a silent, lethal storm. The messenger, for all his predatory grace, had no chance against academy-trained reflexes enhanced by fresh blood. Sarah's hand chopped down on the back of his neck with precise force, and he crumpled without a sound. Valeric spun around, his sword clearing its scabbard in a flash of dark steel. But he was too slow. Nikolai stepped out of the shadows, no longer the hesitant student from the academy. In his hand was a silver stake, one of 3 Sarah had insisted they carry. He moved with fluid economy, years of drilling finally manifesting in crisis. He deflected Valeric's wild swing with his forearm and pressed the point of the stake against the captain's throat with his other hand. "Drop it, Valeric," Nikolai commanded, his voice as cold and hard as the stone around them. "Or I will end a decade of loyal service to my family in the most permanent way imaginable." Valeric's eyes widened in shock and terror. His sword clattered to the ground. He had underestimated the scholar prince. They all had. "The scroll," Sarah said, Her own blade now pressed against Valeric's back. He trembled, fumbling to retrieve the sealed message. He handed it to Nikolai with shaking fingers. Nikolai broke the seal and angled the parchment to catch the faint starlight. His face grew grim as he read. "It's written in cipher," he said slowly. "The diplomatic cipher I created years ago for communications with the clan elders. I designed it to protect them from court spies. Darius stole it. He's been using my own creation against me." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the coded text, his brilliant mind working through the pattern he'd invented. When he looked up, his expression was one of profound betrayal. "These aren't battle coordinates. They're assassination targets. Specific locations where clan leaders gather. Elder Kalen's family grove, the Shadowfen winter settlement, the sacred grounds where they hold their councils." He looked at Valeric, his eyes burning with cold fire. "My brother wasn't just planning to kill me. He was planning to slaughter the clan leadership and blame it on a Strigoi ambush during our mission. He would return as the avenging prince, crush the treacherous clans under martial law, and consolidate absolute power." "And you were the perfect scapegoat," Sarah added, understanding dawning. "Dead on the road, unable to defend your reputation. He could paint you as having failed in your diplomatic mission, making the clan's betrayal seem justified." Nikolai held up the cipher scroll and the supply documents from the archives. "We have everything we need to expose him." He looked down at Valeric, who was trembling in their grasp. "And we have a witness." Valeric's face had gone pale with terror. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Prince Darius will kill me. He'll kill my family. He has people everywhere. You can't fight him." "Your family?" Nikolai's voice was suddenly quiet, deadly. "Tell me, Captain, did you have family stationed at Fort Ashworth?" Valeric's face went from pale to ashen. My daughter. She was a guardian there. But the prince said she'd been reassigned before." His voice broke off as the realization hit him. No, she was on the duty roster. I saw it myself 3 months before the attack. He told me she'd been transferred." "She wasn't transferred," Nikolai said, his voice hard but not without pity. "She was there when the fort fell. Captain Valeric, your prince used you to murder your own child." Something broke in Valeric then. The loyal soldier, the dutiful servant, shattered like glass. His legs buckled and he would have fallen if Sarah hadn't held him up. "Katya," he whispered, his voice raw with anguish. "My little Katya. She wrote to me 3 weeks before the attack. She said the blood rations were being reduced. She said the guardians were getting weaker. She asked if I could look into it. I told her it was probably just a supply chain issue. I told her not to worry." His hands were shaking violently. "I killed her. I helped him kill my own daughter." "Darius killed her," Nikolai said firmly. "You were a tool, a weapon he used. But now you can make it right. Now you can make sure her death means something. You can help us stop him before he kills anyone else's children." Valeric looked up, tears streaming down his face, but his eyes were hard with a father's rage. "What do you need me to do?" The Grand Gala was a tradition as old as the dynasty itself, a celebration held on the autumn equinox. This year, however, it was a strained, somber affair. The usual decadent revelry was replaced by tense whispers and fearful glances. The threat of the Strigoi hung over the festivities like a shroud. And yet the court was out in force, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, determined to project an image of strength and unshakable confidence. But the gala served another purpose this year. The king's invitation to the border clan leaders was not a request, it was a summons. When Valerius Volkov summoned the clans to court, refusal meant being labeled Strigoi sympathizers. So they came, dressed in their traditional garb, daggers hidden in silk, to negotiate for their people's survival in a ballroom. Chieftain Mira of the Shadowfen stood with the clan delegation, her clan markings tattooed proudly on her face, her eyes sharp and watchful. She was Elder Kalen's daughter, the designated representative of the northern clans. The so-called gala was actually an emergency war council, and everyone knew it. Darius had insisted Nikolai and Sarah attend. "It would be unseemly for you to leave for the north without showing your face to the court," he had said, his voice slick with false concern. "They must see that the royal family is united in this time of crisis." It was part of his plan. He needed them at the gala to establish their presence, to create his alibi. While everyone was distracted by the festivities, his assassins would discover them missing from their chambers, making it appear they'd left early for the north and been ambushed on the road. Sarah wore a simple dark blue gown, elegant but practical, allowing for full range of motion. Strapped to her thigh, hidden beneath the fabric, was a silver stake. Nikolai stood beside her, dressed in the formal black and silver of his house. He looked every inch the prince he no longer was, but his face was a mask of calm control, his eyes missing nothing. They had spent the day refining their plan. They had used Valeric, broken and motivated by grief-fueled rage, to send a new message to the assassins waiting at Blackwood Pass. A message changing the time and location, buying them crucial time. They had also, through the handful of guards Sarah had identified as being loyal to Nikolai's memory, spread carefully chosen rumors, whispers of evidence, whispers of treason. The court was a powder keg, and they were about to light the fuse. The moment came just after midnight. King Valerius rose from his seat on the dais, preparing to make a speech to reassure his nervous court. At that exact moment, Nikolai stepped forward from the edge of the hall, his presence commanding immediate attention. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "Father," Nikolai said, his voice clear and strong, echoing in the sudden silence. "Before you speak of the unity of this kingdom, there is a matter of profound betrayal that must be addressed. A betrayal that has cost hundreds of lives and threatens to destroy us all." King Valerius froze, his face darkening. Darius, standing beside the throne, shot Nikolai a look of pure venom. "Brother, this is neither the time nor the place for your theatrics." "On the contrary," Nikolai interrupted, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of nobles, guards, and clan leaders alike. "This is precisely the time and place. For too long, the enemies of this kingdom have thrived in the shadows. Tonight, we bring them into the light." He strode to the center of the hall, turning to face the assembled court. The crowd parted before him like water. "You all know that Fort Ashworth has fallen. You have been told it was the work of Strigoi and treacherous border clans. That is a lie." He held up the supply documents. "This is the proof. Records showing that our guardians in the north were deliberately starved. Their blood supplies systematically reduced for 3 months, leaving them too weak to defend their posts when the attack came. This was not a defeat. It was a massacre, orchestrated from within our own walls." Murmurs of shock and horror rippled through the crowd like wildfire. King Valerius's face was thunderous. "Nikolai, what is the meaning of this? Who would dare commit such a treasonous act?" Nikolai's eyes found his brothers across the hall. The orders were authorized by someone who saw this crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Someone so consumed by ambition that he would sacrifice his own people to secure his path to the throne. He let the accusation hang in the air for a heartbeat, the tension unbearable. These manifests were authorized by Crown Prince Darius. The accusation struck the hall like a physical blow. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Then came the explosion of voices, gasps, shouts, denials. Darius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that cut through the chaos. "This is absurd. My brother returns after 5 years and makes these wild accusations? He's clearly addled from his time playing at being a commoner. Father, have him seized. This is treason." "It is not a baseless accusation," a new voice called out, strong despite its tremor. Captain Valeric stepped forward from the crowd, his face pale but resolute. He fell to his knees before the throne. "My king, I confess my part in this treason. I acted on the direct orders of Prince Darius. I helped him coordinate the sabotage of Fort Ashworth. I helped him arrange communications for the planned assassination of Prince Nikolai. His voice broke. And in doing so, I unknowingly helped him murder my own daughter, Guardian Katya Valeric, who died defending that fort. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted, guards shifted nervously, clan members reached for their weapons. Darius stared at his captain, his face contorting with rage and disbelief. "You traitorous coward! You lie!" He drew his sword, the polished steel gleaming in the firelight. "You will die for this!" But he didn't lunge at Valeric. He lunged at Nikolai, his movements filled with desperate fury. He was fast, a warrior trained from birth. But Sarah was faster. She moved like lightning, a blur of dark blue silk, her hidden stake now in her hand. She intercepted Darius's attack, her forearm deflecting his sword arm with a jarring impact that echoed through the hall. She didn't strike him. She simply appeared between the two brothers, an immovable barrier. The hall filled with the whisper of drawn steel. The royal guard, that monolithic symbol of dynastic unity, fractured down the center like a split gemstone. Half moved toward Nikolai, their weapons raised in his defense. Half moved toward Darius, their loyalty to the crown prince unwavering. The court watched in horror as guards who had trained together, bled together, now faced each other across drawn blades. The king, for perhaps the first time in his long reign, saw his authority made irrelevant by divided steel. Darius's eyes were wide with shock as he stared at Sarah, at the guards who had moved to protect his brother, at the court that was watching his world collapse. "You," he gasped, backing away. "The game is over, Darius," Nikolai said calmly from behind Sarah's protective stance. He held up the cipher scroll. "And this is your kill list. The coordinates of the clan leaders you planned to have murdered after you killed me. I believe Chieftain Mira is in the room tonight. Perhaps she would be interested to see how you planned to repay her family's generations of loyalty." From the edge of the room, Chieftain Mira of the Shadowfen rose from her seat, her clan markings seeming to writhe in the firelight. Her hand moved to the ceremonial dagger at her belt. "You invited us here for peace talks," she said, her voice cold as winter iron, carrying across the silent hall. "While planning to slaughter my family in their beds? My father, my children, all marked for death." She took a step forward, and the other clan delegates moved with her, a wall of barely contained fury. "The clans will remember this, Volkov. We will remember." Darius was trapped. He looked from the clan delegates to the horrified faces of the Moroi nobles, to the damning evidence in his brother's hand, to his father's face, which was a mask of cold, unforgiving fury. He had lost. The court had seen. The clans had seen. His carefully constructed plan lay in ruins at his feet. Darius realized in that moment that he'd lost more than his conspiracy. He'd lost half the military. The guards who stood with Nikolai outnumbered his own loyal men. With a roar of pure, desperate rage, he shoved through the line of guards and ran. But he didn't run toward the main doors where more guards waited. He ran toward a tapestry on the side wall, tore it aside, and vanished into the passage beyond. "He uses the crown's egress," King Valerius roared, surging to his feet, his voice shaking with rage. "As if he still has the right. As if the throne is still his." The crown's egress was the ancient ceremonial passage built for royal evacuations, a sacred route that symbolized the dynasty's right to survival. For Darius to use it now was a final assertion of legitimacy, a claim that he was still the rightful heir, even in disgrace. "Guards, after him," the king commanded. But the guards hesitated, bound by centuries of protocol. The crown's egress was sacred. To pursue a royal through it was to violate ancient law. Those critical seconds of hesitation gave Darius the lead he needed. "Find him," the king thundered again, and this time the guards moved, but Sarah knew it was too late. Darius knew every secret of the palace. He would be gone into the city within minutes, vanished into the labyrinth of Volkovgrad's underworld. But it didn't matter. The truth was out. The court had witnessed everything. Nikolai stood in the center of the chaos, still holding the evidence, Sarah at his side. The guards who had moved to protect him remained in formation, a clear statement of their allegiance. King Valerius strode down from the dais, his face carved from granite. He stopped before Nikolai, his eyes flicking from his son's face to their joined hands. Nikolai had reached out and taken Sarah's hand in the aftermath, an unconscious gesture of solidarity. "You have exposed a traitor," the king said, each word seeming to cost him greatly. "You have revealed a plot that would have destroyed the clan alliance and endangered the entire kingdom. You have served your people well." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the hall for all to hear. "The court sees you, Nikolai Volkov. The people will hear of this. They will see a true son of the dynasty, a true heir." It was an offer, a path back, a chance to reclaim everything he had lost. With Darius exposed and fled, the throne stood empty of a worthy successor. The old families who had never accepted his abdication were watching with hungry eyes. Chieftain Mira and the clan delegates were watching with cautious respect. The guards who had stood with him were watching with hope. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, her hand tightening on his. This was the true test. This was the moment that would define everything. The crown he had walked away from was being offered again, not as an obligation, but as an earned right, as recognition, as power freely given. Nikolai looked at his father, his expression unreadable. The hall fell silent, waiting for his response. Every eye in the room was fixed on him. Finally, he spoke. "I did not do this for the kingdom," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the stillness, "or for the Volkov line. I did this because it was right. I did this to stop a murderer from taking a throne he did not deserve." He looked around the opulent, chaotic hall, at the fearful eyes of the nobles, at the cold stone walls that had been his prison as much as his home. "This is your world, Father, your cage of ceremony and calculation. I want no part of it." He looked down at Sarah, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time since they had arrived in the capital. "My world is waiting for me. My life is waiting for me." He turned, still holding her hand, and began to walk away from the throne, away from the power and the poison. He walked toward the main doors, toward the life he had chosen 5 years ago and was choosing again now. And Sarah, the guardian, the half-breed, the shield who had become his equal, walked with him, not a step behind, but right by his side. Behind them, the court erupted into chaos. Some voices called for him to stay, others cried out in confusion. Chieftain Mira's voice rose above the din. "Prince Nikolai, the clans will remember this night. You have earned our trust. If you ever have need of us, you have but to send word." Nikolai raised his free hand in acknowledgement, but did not stop walking. They passed through the grand doors and into the cool night air of the palace courtyard. The stars were bright overhead, the sky clear and infinite. Behind them, they could still hear the tumult of the gala, the death throes of Darius's ambitions, the birth of a new political order they wanted no part of. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked softly as they walked toward the stables. "That was everything you gave up once. It was being offered back. No strings. Earned, not demanded." Nikolai stopped, turning to face her fully. He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "I made my choice 5 years ago, when I walked away from this palace with you. I made it again tonight, and I will make it every day for the rest of my life, Sarah. They can keep their throne, their power, their games. I have something infinitely more valuable." He kissed her forehead gently. "I have a life worth living, and I have you." She felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. She was a guardian. Guardians didn't cry. But perhaps in this moment she could be something more than a guardian. She could be a woman who had found her home in a person rather than a place. "Then let's go home," she whispered. They mounted their horses in silence, the palace guards who had been assigned to them standing back respectfully. As they rode through the city gates one final time, the obsidian walls of Volkovgrad receding behind them, Sarah felt the weight of the past 2 days lifting from her shoulders. They had walked into the viper's nest and emerged victorious. More importantly, they had emerged together. The road north stretched before them, dark and quiet under the stars. But they weren't riding toward duty or obligation. They were riding toward the small cottage with its herb garden and stone walls, toward mornings making tea, toward quiet evenings by the fire, toward the life they had built with their own hands, free from the chains of dynasty and destiny. Behind them, the capital burned with gossip and intrigue, with the machinery of power reshuffling itself in the wake of Darius's fall. But they didn't look back. They had made their choice, and it was the only choice that had ever truly mattered. They rode into the darkness, and the darkness welcomed them home.